Hello and welcome. This is a new edition of Fixed on Racing, brought to you by Monmouth Bets. This is our show for Saturday, September 30th. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornatale, coming to you from the Brooklyn Bunker. And we do not have the full lineup we expected for tonight's show due to some weather issues, but we still got a great show for you. And we're going to kick it off talking about some racing at Delaware Park on Saturday, but we have some business to get to before we get to that. And to do that with us, I will bring in the man who's been a part of every one of these. He's a very active in the behind the scenes stuff going on for Monmouth Bets / BetMakers. He's Dallas Baker. How are you, Dallas?
Good, Pete. Good. Unfortunately, I think we're bypassing Monmouth at Meadowlands this week because it looks all but certain to be called off again due to Ophelia still sticking around, which I'm sure you know plenty about. But so it'll be Josh Brown will be taking us through Delaware. We'll have a bit of a chat with our man Nick Tammaro on his thoughts on Delaware as well too. So Delaware gets front and centre today, and naturally Naresh Nagrani to wrap us up with a couple of winners from Caymanas Park. But yep, Pete, even though it's a lighter card and we've lost a little bit due to rain, still plenty of promos at Monmouth Bets, and if people want to have a crack, if you're in New Jersey, you can bet fixed odds only at Monmouth Bets, and we've got plenty of offers as usual, Pete.
Indeed. And what I love about these offers, yes, they are for new players. You can go to the Monmouth Bet site and get a bonus if you're signing up as a new account holder. Also bonuses for returning account holders. And then on selected races, the opportunity to get money back if your horse finishes underneath your top pick. The specifics of all those terms will be right there on the Monmouth Bets website, and it's all pretty intuitive from there. Does that about cover the bonus action this week, Dallas? Should we get to the racing?
I think we should, and I think it's probably time for you to welcome in our first guest, mate.
Very, very happy to have back with us a returning guest who comes to us from down there in Delaware, man, with a lot of announcing and racetrack experience. It was terrific in his first appearance on the show. Josh Brown. Josh, what's going on down there in Delaware?
Well, we, just like you guys up in New York, we have to stomach the storm that went by. I think we're going to be off the turf all week long. So with the Saturday show coming up, I did handicap the races to be off the turf. And unfortunately, we're supposed to get some rain for Friday into Saturday morning. So let's dive on in. We don't have a lot to choose from if we do come off the turf. But I'll tell you what, Peter, there's some money to be made and some favorites that can be beat.
I love to hear that. And we were saying, cancellations, races off the turf. Hey, there's still a winner in every race, and sometimes the track conditions and or off-turf situations can create opportunities, especially when you're talking about fixed odds betting. Let those scratches come in. Take a look at those first prices. Maybe you can find something that you really, really like. We're starting off with
Pete. That is a really good point too, because with the more variations, the more holes there are going to be in the market. And we're not going to be perfect with them. So if you're there and you think that you've got a bit of an edge, you can snipe early and get on and try to find those overs early as conditions change. So if you want to have a bit of a guess at the weather, you can get some very good overs, which, that's a very good point to shop to see if you can shop early, because there might be some really good value for you there for horses getting double, triple the odds on horses if you can back your own ability.
the name of the game. Getting over is an international gambling expression, which you just call here an overlay, when the price you're getting is better than the price on the board. And that's something you have many, many more opportunities to do with fixed odds betting than you do with traditional tote betting. Josh, general question first. When the track at Delaware gets wet, is there a prevailing bias? I mean, I think typically when it's active rain, often helps horses who are on the front just because the kickback gets so nasty. Is that something you see at Delaware?
I think so. Even from a race caller's point of view, Peter, we look for horses that don't have any mud on their silks. And in the case of the question you asked me, I do feel like a lot of races when we get a rain affected track, which is surprisingly not often here in the 3 years I've been calling here at Delaware, you really need to be on the front end. I can't really remember someone who's a mud soaked mess that's closing from out of the back of the pack. So I believe with a sealed track, I noticed they don't race on the rail here at this particular track. So I really feel you need to be within the first 2 or 3 lanes on the lead. And those sprint races, route races, of course, Peter, can be a different situation. They have more time to get their legs going. But to answer your question, yeah, I think you have to be on the front end here at Delaware to really have a say when the track comes up anything but wet, fast, or even good. If it's muddy, if it's sloppy, yeah, it's probably on the front end.
Yeah, and it's so you got to pay attention to, because a drying out track can be the opposite story at times. But it sounds like that's sort of prevailing bias we see these days, where you don't necessarily want to be on the rail, but you do want to be forward. Just something to look for. But of course, if you're going to play the bias game, as Mike Maloney, the handicapping professional and author, says, you better do it on your toes if you want to dance with bias. Let's talk about race number 2 at Delaware on Saturday. We've got fillies and mares, $16,000 claimers, going 6 furlongs on the dirt. Field of 6 as of now scheduled to go postward. Doesn't look like there's a ton of pace in here to my eye. Josh, who do you like?
This race here, I'm going to go with number 1, Fancy Warrior. As you pointed to, this race just has no pace. And I don't know about handicappers out there, but I treat a non-winners of 2 lifetime like a maiden race. And I say that because the only win was versus maiden. So they really don't have experience beating other horses that have won 2, 3, or 4 races. Getting to the meat of potatoes of this, number 1, Fancy Warrior, had a couple of runs down at Colonial, wasn't disgraced last time out at 5.5 to 1. Tracked in that particular race, was 3 wide, was closing in late. I'm hoping with that buyer speed figure of 58 last time out, that's one of the strongest ones on the paper race. And you guys, I think Fancy Warrior at the 12.5 level last time out should be okay at $14,000. And I definitely would put the punters in the right direction if you're going to back the 1, Fancy Warrior, on fixed odds.
The next race is the very next race. We move on to race number 3, and we've got a maiden claimer that we are expecting to come off the turf. And Josh, I know you were very interested to talk a little bit about Tough Enough in this spot.
Yeah, that race is what I like to call a stale race. From a handicapping point of view, any race that's a year or older from today's date, I call them stale races. So this horse debuted on the week of the Kentucky Derby, May 7th at Churchill Downs. The horse flashed a lot of early speed, only lost by half a length when everything was said and done. It was a key race where the 3rd place finisher came back to win its next race. Fast forward, the horse didn't start for over 2 years, was at Colonial on the turf, really didn't run a step, showed a lot of speed last time out, 7 to 1. Because this race is going to possibly be off the turf, this horse is entered for the main track only. There's only one horse in here that has pace, and that's the 5, Tough Enough. Catch Tough Enough to cash on Saturday.
Dallas, let's just do a quick tangent. I think this is a good chance to just reiterate what happens to, let's say, and I don't think it's going to happen exactly in this situation, but those turf prices we showed, the race comes onto the dirt. What happens if you've already made a bet and then there's a surface switch with fixed odds?
Well, generally what we're doing at the moment, Pete, when it is dicey, we're not going up until the decision has been made. So therefore there isn't any early bets. But funnily enough, our ideal model is basically to have the situation where if you've had a bet beforehand, so open it up, and then all the scratchings come out. Obviously, the market is totally different, so we need to adjust that as a bookmaker. But we now have a feature of closing price. So if you're trying to have a bet before the markets are up, you can select closing price, and then you get the last price that was bet on fixed odds, which is generally competitive because the percentages are going to be generally better as you get closer to the race. So what we're hopefully developing in the next few weeks will be the ability for one, if anyone's had a bet before off the turf happens, that they can then cancel their bet. Normally in fixed odds, you can't cancel a bet, but allow that for that change because it's obviously a dramatic change and some people have a different opinion. But for those still holding a ticket, that then moves to a closing price. So whilst that isn't there yet, that's the perfect model that we think we've been able to come up with, which enables early betting on the turf races, and then also we're being a little bit gratuitous to ourselves, protects us from betting 20 to 1 about a horse that's going to be 2 to 1 on the dirt. So we thought that was the right balance for it, and that's where we'll get to hopefully in the next coming weeks. But for the moment, when it's even if it's a very minor possibility, we won't go up on the turf races until the decision has been made.
I think that's very sensible. That's an exciting new feature. One of the things we're going to be doing on these fixed on racing shows is talking about the evolution of Monmouth bets and fixed odds betting in America as we go on. So we'll have plenty more tangents along those lines to keep folks up on all the new and cool features, like different promos that come up and also different ways of wagering. Let's move on to race number 7. This is another one originally scheduled for the turf. This one does not have the main track only entrance that race 3 had. Originally scheduled for 5 furlongs on the turf, will run the same distance on the dirt. Moon Boots, not just a hunch play for those remembering third grade fashion. I don't know if they have Moon Boots anymore, but I definitely had a pair at one point. Josh, talk about this horse and why you find him interesting in this spot. Why do you find her interesting in this spot?
So the replay was interesting because the horse had a very slow start, rushed up, still won by 2 lengths going away. This race, I think you'll probably see maybe 2 or 3 scratches because a lot of these horses do have dirt form. There's 2 horses on the paper race. I really wanted to point to the 7 Honey Bella. I think the horse is the speed coming in from Canterbury. The problem is this horse has had a bad case of second-itis. 3 second-place finishes. If the pace is hot, which we all know at 5 furlongs might not necessarily develop, I think Moon Boots is going to be sitting off the pace. And guys, Moon Boots, she is the absolute class of the race. And this is only the 2nd start since June. I think last might have been a prep race. And if the horse runs back to those Parks races, just like the replay, I think Moon Boots is going to be knocking those boots right on the door of the winner's circle.
I like it. 2nd off the layoff, back in just 11 days off that 101-day layoff, and all that good dirt form in the book. It's easy to see the attraction to Moon Boots. It will be very interesting to see how this finally gets priced up. Moon Boots, a juicy potential early price, but of course with the surface, which we'll have to pay attention. Go back to Monmouth Bets, check it out. Make sure you pay attention to all those late declarations, etc. Well, there's 3 thoughts from Delaware. We might chat a little bit more about Delaware later in the show. We're not going to let Nick Tammaro get off without joining us later just because there is no Monmouth at Meadowlands. But Josh, love those ideas. Once again, appreciate very much having you on. We'll listen to you with great interest on the mic, and we'll have you back soon.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Good luck to everyone. Like I said, there's a lot of value on the card, but you got to search through it on this upcoming Saturday.
And we'll be back right after this. Peter Thomas, Fornatale, back with you from the Brooklyn Bunker. We are joined by our second guest. Dallas is still here, and we bring in a man who's going to talk to us a little bit more about the Delaware Park card and maybe go on a tangent or 2 as well. From InTheMoneyPodcast.com, he's Nick Tammaro. Nick, how are things?
Tangent's my middle name, in fact. So, yeah, glad to be with you. Things are going great. Good to see you boys again. A little different format this time around, different races maybe, but we're ready to roll anyway.
I got a bone to pick with you before we start, because I'm still so mad about this wager I made on your Houston Astros in early in the month. I really thought I was getting the best of it, getting just under even money. I looked ahead at the schedule, Nick. I thought I was such a wise guy. I looked ahead at the schedule and I said, 6 games against teams that are going to lose 100. There's no way they're not winning this division. Tell you what, they did everything else they had to do, except I think they lost about 5 of those 6 games to the 100-loss teams. And now I'm on the outside looking in. What happened here?
Well, even worse than that is they had 9 against those teams, right? They had 6 against Kansas City and 3 against Oakland, where they won a whopping 2-7.
Oh,
I mean, they were looking like a 95-loss team there for a while. It was not.
Oh, and 6 of those 9 at home. We'll
6 of those 9 were at home, exactly. Yeah. I mean, maybe the bone to pick is with you, and it was because of your wager that happened. But yeah, no joy in Mudville of late for the Houston Astros, but they could still kind of. I'll tell you. I mean, and I know the tangents are usually saved for horse racing, but it's so funny how they might get into the wild card as the 6th seed, and there is an appreciable advantage to being the 6th seed versus being the 5. I mean, it is significantly softer in terms of getting to the ALCS, which would be their 6th straight ALCS. No, 7th straight, actually. So again, it's much easier if you're the 6th. If they're the 6th, they would be looking at Minnesota and Texas. If they're the 5, they'd be looking at Tampa and Baltimore.
Right.
So yeah, MLB, if you're listening, please start reseeding these
Reseed.
playoffs.
You got to
Yeah,
reseed.
and the other thing is the division winner should not be guaranteed home field advantage. They should be guaranteed a ticket to the dance, but not necessarily a home series.
We'll get this going later on our baseball pod. Fortunately, as much as I've done my money in baseball, we've had horse racing to make our to make our money, and for me, fixed odds has been a big piece of that. And I wanted to talk to you. This was an idea that Dallas brought up specifically. We were talking in the last segment about trying to anticipate track bias where possible when certain weather systems are coming in, etc. And I wanted to ask you, as one of the more respected horse players out there, how much track bias in general factors into your horse playing, your handicapping on the day, and then how much you look at it in evaluating these past races going forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge factor, no doubt about it. When the biases come up, especially when they come up out of nowhere, they're really frustrating. So, during the recently concluded Saratoga meet, there were a couple of days late in the meet where we had an appreciable track bias that really came out of nowhere. And, when you're making a multi-race bet, that makes things very difficult, especially if they're on the early races. But, when a bias shows up, it's just time to hunker down and figure out what it is and who to bet back. It's basically just as simple as that. So, I noticed a couple of things bias wise at that meet, but I think the danger is in anticipating it. If you're expecting that something's going to happen, maybe because of weather. I know the old adage, and I sat there. I remember being a 8-year-old kid sitting at Trinity Meadows and watching an old-fashioned North Texas thunderstorm just come cascading down, and looking out at the track and thinking to myself, it's got to be really hard to get mud thrown in your face the whole time and keep on running. And so, I thought to myself, well, you're supposed to bet speed on sloppy tracks. But I do think that in general, not necessarily track specific, it is better to be forwardly placed on a sloppy track. I mean, of the circuits that I follow closely, most of those are pretty fair wet tracks. So I think what you want to do is, I'd probably summarize it by saying, number one, you want to be as objective as possible. You cannot be subjective about any of it. You can't say, oh, my horse ran bad, so there's got to be a track bias, or this horse underperformed, so there's got to be a track bias. What you're looking for in assessing a bias and using some of the data moving forward are horses that overperformed or underperformed relative to where they were and their odds. Yeah. So, if you're noticing that 6 horses in a row went wire to wire and none of them paid more than $7, that might not be a bias. That's just a chalky card, right? But if one of them in the 8th race won at 30-1, and he was on the rail or she was on the rail the whole way and wired the field, you're probably starting to look at a bias, right? Because the public, even with the track looking like it was tilted in one direction, didn't have any regard for that horse. So I think it's maintaining that objectivity. And then as far as it goes moving forward, I don't think you can automatically bet all of those horses back, because you have to look at the scenarios they're getting themselves into. If they're horses that are going to make deep, wide closing moves, and they come back because they ran against the grain of the track and they end up in a race with no pace, well, I mean, you want to bet them back because they were against the grain of the track, but now the race flows against them. So now pack your patience even more and get them the next time.
And I think there's so many keys to it. Is that obviously my expertise is on grass tracks, because that's all we have in Australia, essentially, a couple of synthetic tracks, but it's essentially grass racing. Grass racing tracks have lanes in them. When the rail moves, there are different sections of the track which are generally faster than the other. Now, track bias in Australia, I think you in the US have embraced it a lot more. You mentioned track bias in Australia, and a lot of officials will sort of almost warn you off the track because you're saying something against it, which it happens. We worked it out at Randwick. There was a bloke called Hugh Bowman who worked out at Randwick. The lanes 8 to 10 off the true rail are pretty much the best rail lanes to be in, and probably the most successful rider at Randwick of all time, funnily enough. But those lanes don't exist, remember. But I think there's tracks that will have, as I said, lanes in them, especially on a grass track, that is. But also too, it's how you read it, and like the amount of times that you've got an absolute leader bias track, and then something will come from behind in the last, and all the people who say bias doesn't exist, I'll say, "Oh, see, you were wrong. You were wrong." Nothing is an absolute in racing. It's an advantage. So if you've got like a 3 or 4 length bias, which is in the center of the track or the fence, that means it's a 3 or 4 length advantage. It doesn't mean every other horse can't possibly win. And you'll see the rails are off awfully all day somewhere, but something will get up, especially maybe over a distance race where saving ground is a lot more important than being out wide. And that then factors into it. But as Nick was saying too, it also then comes down to the tempo of the race. It's not an absolute, it's an advantage. But then if everyone is just lardy-darring in front and then it's this 400-meter sprint home, that 4-length advantage isn't going to help you too much if you're 12 lengths off a very, very slow pace lead. And then it becomes almost mathematically impossible for you to do it. And I think the tricks to looking at, if you don't want to go in with the preconceived ideas, and I think the preconceived are much more for turf than dirt. But if you don't want to do that, you want to be looking for horses that are doing something they shouldn't. Like, it's not, as Nick was saying, if 5 winners who are 1 to 2 have led and won, that isn't giving you a bias. That's saying the horses that should have won the race. What you want to be looking for is the little giveaways. Like a horse on the fence that is 4 million to 1, that has been on a fast pace, and everything's in the center of the track, and this 4 million to 1 horse that should have stopped at the halfway down is still there fighting out the finish, or, running well and truly over and above what it should be doing. If you're looking to assess the bias, they're the things you want to look for. What shouldn't have happened in this race? And is that reason why that thing that shouldn't have happened because of track bias? They're your giveaways. One of the best ways to judge track bias is looking for the horses at massive odds that are doing something that they shouldn't. Not saying, oh, the favourite's led and won, so it's a leader's track. Well, yes, the favourite led and won because it's the favourite. It got the right tempo and it won. That isn't track bias. That isn't giving you track bias. That's just saying that's how the race panned out as it should have.
Easy to get fooled. Yeah, it's easy to get fooled by randomness with this stuff. I think you make a lot of great points about looking at the prices of the horses. I think that's a fantastic shortcut. Of course, and the best thing you can do is just if you have a card properly handicapped, then you can even sharpen up what those odds are by knowing what you as a horse player thought should have happened. Lots to unpack there. I love what you said about the, I think pace sectionals will often trump bias in those extreme instances. That's a great point. And when you were talking about the lanes and the lane biases, Nick, that made me think back to Saratoga on some of those days. It was obviously a weird turf course in Saratoga this year. And some of those days where, the rail came down and you had to be, it seemed like you had to be inside. Is that part of the Saratoga bias you noticed? And is that something you see in these USA turf courses where that fresh ground will often be a place that you want to be as opposed to what's been run on over the past several days?
Yeah, I think so. I think it does play out that way. I mean, I actually noticed, and I kind of felt like it during the last week and a half or so of the meet. And I consulted with a friend that does a lot of trip and path bias work. And I said, I don't think the rail on the Mellon turf was actually very good the last week and a half or so of the meet. And there were just a lot of horses that underperformed. And, that could have easily had a lot to do with the fact that they took a copious amount of rain throughout the meet, and that has to drain somewhere. And most turf courses drain towards the inside. So, I mean, it's very clear that grass likely got heavier. And there were a lot of horses, I think, who really spun their wheels coming back. I've seen a couple of them run back well. So I feel like it is a bias that is worth following a little bit more. But again, I mean, you have to maintain your objectivity, like we've kind of been saying. The other thing that I would mention as far as this conversation goes with regards to American racing is that one of the things that we grew accustomed to seeing in this country for a long time, because the majority of our racing is on dirt. I mean, still the majority is, it's not by nearly as much anymore, but a lot of the safety measures that track superintendents put in place ended up deadening a lot of rails. And you're going to notice that on a regular basis, more modern jockeys are consistently 2+ paths off the rail. And if you're handicapping on a regular basis with any level of seriousness, you have to be watching some head-ons just to get a sense of what's going on. As you watch head-ons on dirt, you're going to see horses staying way off the inside, especially relative to where they were, 15, 20, 30 years ago. And that makes an enormous difference. So that also adds in a layer of nuance as well, because did they stay off the rail because that's just their preference, or did they stay off the rail because the rail's bad? And, was it cozier and quicker to be in the 2-path? So you want to look at it with I would say as clear a set of eyes as possible, and, be open to every idea. The worst thing you can do is get yourself married to something early on, because then all you're pretty much going to do is lose money.
Yeah, and also you made a really good point there, Nick, that whoever created the universe, some people have different opinions on that. But, from pretty much the moment this planet was created, water goes from a high point to a low point.
Right.
A higher point dries quicker than a lower point. Now, most tracks are cambered. So, like you're saying that when there is rain or wetness around, and also especially with turf tracks, more so when there's artificial watering as well too, because that doesn't fall as consistently. Obviously, rain, everything's down, sprinklers, yeah, whatever. But yeah, high point, low point. Dries quicker, water runs down that way. It's been doing it for quite a while.
I'll tell you, the mad genius himself, Michael Dickinson, was onto something walking on turf courses in stilettos to try and figure out where the best paths were. Just ask the Haas.
Great stuff. All right, should we dive into some specifics here at Delaware Park? We've got the 6th race on the docket, not one that we covered earlier in the show, but one that Nick had a thought on. What were you thinking about this one, Nick?
I'd like to get a decent enough price on this horse, but the horse that kind of drew my attention a little bit was the 3 Goldini, and I mean, fully acknowledging that Goldini is going to have to run better than he has, at least in his last dirt start. This is a bit of a wet track play. This is a horse who's been appreciably better on wet tracks than he's been on dry surfaces. The anticipation is there's going to be quite a bit of rain in the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast on Friday into Saturday. And he had no chance last time against a really salty group of 12-5 claimers up at Saratoga. Burgee was coming in for Lacey Gaudet from the Mid-Atlantic, and had been a horse that was competitive in higher level claiming races for a while. Durkins, Colin Hammer, and Ammer are 2 really old school hard-knocking claimers in New York. So I think his form line there kind of holds up a little bit, and he was badly pace compromised that day. I think the gamble that you're making here is that Little Demon, who's going to be a deserving heavy favorite coming off a huge performance for Jamie Ness. Maybe he gets hooked up in a battle with Fast Break and Winter's Ghost potentially, and that sets the table for a horse like Goldini, who'd want to do some of his better running later.
Goldini in race 6, and let's hop ahead a couple to race number 8 for this field of nickel claimers going 1.70 miles. What do you think is going to play out on the track at Delaware for this one?
Yeah, nothing wildly clever. I like the 1 Zipper Zapper, who I think just might control this race from the start and has been in pretty good form. Now, first off, the claim by Jose Ramirez, but looks like a good fit at this $5,000 level. The last 2 times they've run him there, they've been 2 of his better races to date. And again, it could easily end up being a situation where this horse is isolated on the front end. And, that just might be all she wrote. He's a bit of a tough horse to trust, but I do think that the good recent form, the way he's worked his way back into it, is pretty encouraging.
And bias or no, that position of being in what the Brits call splendid isolation on the lead can be very effective, of course, all the time in racing, let alone on a day when we think things could be a little bit more tilted in that direction. Dallas, any closing thoughts from you before we send this edition of Fixed On Racing to the printer?
Yeah, Pete, as we mentioned, plenty of bonuses around, which will come up on the screen towards the end of the show. But as we've said many a times, Pete, there's bonuses and all of that. But if you can get to New Jersey, the number 1 bonus is getting around fixed odds and getting used to it, playing the game, getting all the extra value that you get, and really enjoying what is going to be building throughout the US over the next few years. So get involved with it now, start learning it, and get ahead of the market. Like reading track bias, things like that, all other things that you talk about. It's about getting an edge on the competitors, and your competitors are the people you're betting against, essentially. And if you can understand the fixed odds market before, or the nuances of the fixed odds market, that's putting you ahead of anybody who comes in a month or 2 or 3 or 4 or 2 years. And if you can be ahead of that, then you'll be a winning punter if you can handle yourself well and have a great advantage by doing so.
It's a tremendous opportunity. Monmouth Bets is the place to sign up. Another thing we haven't talked about much on these airwaves that I'll throw in as kind of a closing thought, Dallas and Nick, is something really cool about fixed odds betting, more akin to sports betting, is you have a really good way of testing yourself and where you are as a player, because you can really measure your ability to get the best of the number. You know, if you're consistently betting horses at prices better than that closing price we spoke about earlier, you're doing something right. And if the results aren't there yet, they're going to come if you can do that. And getting that kind of instant feedback, it's a lot easier to know. You play USA Exotics. I mean, Nick, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say you could be great and go on a 6-month slump and hemorrhage money, and you could be bad and win huge over the course of a year, because there's just so much volatility. I think this gives you a little bit of a clear idea, again, of just where you are in your playing journey. What do you think of that hypothesis, Nick?
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. And I think it is kind of a double test of you as a handicapper and bettor, in that you got to find winners and you got to find the right prices. So I do think that it presents an edge if you're able to do both, of course. And the bookmakers are going to be a little sharper than the rest of the parimutuel betting public, but that's okay, because they need to be challenged a little bit as well to make sure that their prices are in line with where they need to be. But yeah, I mean, I think from a sports betting perspective, you know, people who end up getting the most closing line value are generally the most successful, and that's going to be the case with anything involving fixed odds. So you want to make sure that you're really setting your expectations properly and working your way into the right numbers.
Yeah, I mean,
End of the day. Oh, you go ahead, Dallas.
just to wrap up, I mean, you talk to any professional punter who makes their living from it, and I think almost to a person, they are going to say the number one thing is about getting the price. It's not about backing winners. The winners will look after themselves. Get the right price. That is the key.
At the end of the day, we're not backing teams and horses. We're backing prices.
Numbers. Yep.
Something important to consider. Monmouth Bets, a great place to get started or continue this journey. Lots of bonuses available there. Special promotions with money back for placed horses. You can get all the details on the Monmouth Bets site. Get involved, get an account. We're going to be talking about it a lot more in the coming weeks and months and years on these fixed on racing programs. For Dallas, for Nick, for Josh, for our sponsors at Monmouth Bets, I'm Peter Thomas Fornatale. May you win all your photos.